Recommender systems are a method by which sites can personalize the information that users receive. They're particularly useful when there's too many items for users to consider together, like all the books on Amazon or all the movies on Netflix. In this lecture, we'll look at recommender systems, how they work, and discuss some potential applications. You're probably familiar with recommender systems even if you don't recognize the term. For example, on Amazon, when you look at an item, at the bottom it shows you customers who bought this item also bought, and it shows you a list of other books. This is a form of a recommender system. Many of you have probably tried Pandora, which is a music recommender system. If you haven't tried it, I highly recommend it. It's a really interesting site. It makes great recommendations. You start by putting in a band or a song, and it creates a custom radio station for you based on the song that you picked to start with, and then your ratings of other songs that show up. Movie recommendations are probably the most common place to see recommender systems. Netflix has a lot of these, which you probably have run into. This is one from a website called Spout, and it's a list of recommendations for me based on other ratings I put in the system. However, we're not limited to just ratings of movies or music or books. Here's a question. How many cows are in Texas? Now, there are a lot of places that we can look for this information that will tell us that there are millions of cows in Texas. But I once came across a website that said there's no cows in Texas because they had actually all been abducted by aliens and replaced by alien cow doppelgangers. And now, of course, you can go to cowabduction.com to see some of these abductions in process. Of course, most people are going to believe the official government sources that say there's millions of cows in Texas, and they'll trust those sources. But if you truly believe in the government conspiracy to hide us from alien information, you may honestly not trust those sources and want information to answer this question that comes from a different source. In that case, finding trusted information is essentially the same thing as a recommender system. This is where I do a lot of my research, and we'll talk more about this towards the end of the slides. Now, while this cow example is obviously amusing and sort of contrived, we run into this example of finding trusted information all the time. For example, if you consider politics, the people who religiously watch Fox News honestly believe that that's a more trustworthy source of information that's missing the bias they see in other media sources. Those who don't watch Fox News believe that the bias is there and find more unbiased, realistic news in other sources. If you're trying to get information you trust, keeping your opinions and perspectives in mind to point you to the right sources is an important thing to do, and that's also a feature of recommender systems. So what we'll talk about today is first what recommender systems are, and then we'll take a brief look at how they work without getting deep into the mathematical details. We'll talk about how we can integrate social information and social networks and trust into recommender systems, and then look at some potential applications. Let's start by looking at some traditional recommender system applications. I've started watching zombie movies, and here's a few of them pulled out of my Netflix queue. Now, at the bottom of each of these, you can see that there's two recommended ratings. One is the average of all the ratings for the movie, and the other is the average of what they call raters like you. If we look at 28 weeks later in the middle of the screen, you can see that the average of all the ratings is 3.4 stars, while the average of raters like me is 3.6 stars. That means I tend to be more like people who really enjoyed this movie. Amazon has different kinds of recommendations. So, since I was watching all those zombie movies, I decided to read The Zombie Survival Guide, which was a great book. And as we saw before, at the bottom of Amazon's pages, it has recommendations from customers who also bought that item. The Netflix recommendations are based on other people's ratings. These recommendations are based on purchasing history, so it doesn't have anything to do with ratings. Amazon does other types of recommendations, though. If you go to the main recommendation page on your Amazon account, you'll see that I looked at some combat axes and knives after reading the Zombie Survival Guide, and then it has recommendations of other ones for me as well. These are based on purchase history and also my browsing history. There's another browsing history available down at the bottom. It says, since I looked at the Zombie Survival Guide, I might also be interested in these other books. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which I read and highly recommend, and The Zombie Survival Guide Recorded Attacks. These are based on other items that people have purchased, potentially ratings, and browsing behavior. So how do these systems work? Well, there's two main methods that we saw covered in those previous examples. One is that we find things that people like when those people are similar to me. So I look for people who have the same taste as me, I find the things they like, and I recommend those. The other option is to find things that are similar to the things I like. So it'll look at the items that I like, and it'll go find items that are similar to those and recommend them to me. The first approach considers only information from people. It doesn't consider any of the metadata or features of the items. So it only looks for people like me and recommends their favorite things. The second approach doesn't do anything with the people, it only looks at similarity between the items. There are, of course, hybrid approaches that combine this people similarity and item similarity, and they work pretty well. But we'll be talking about these two main features today, person similarity and item similarity. So let's start with the first example with people. We have 5 movies listed across the top here, and then we have 3 users, Alice, Bob, and Chuck. All 3 of our users have rated all 5 of those movies. So we're going to consider needing to make a recommendation for Alice. So we see her ratings in the first row, and we want to know who's a better predictor for her. Which of our other 2 users, Bob and Chuck, can give the most accurate recommendation for Alice? If you look at Chuck's ratings, they're exactly 1 lower than Alice's for everything except 2001, where it's 1 higher. So for Star Wars, Alice gave it a 5 and Chuck gave it a 4. Jaws, Alice gave a 4 and Chuck gave a 3, and so on. So his ratings track hers pretty closely. If we look at Bob's ratings compared to Alice's, they agree on 2001, but on the other movies they're different and there's no real pattern to their difference. So we can intuitively see that Chuck is probably a little bit better for coming up with recommendations than Bob, but we need some mathematical way of doing that. There's a lot of different approaches to this, but one of the simplest is called the Pearson correlation. Essentially, the Pearson correlation talks about the linear relationship. If you map Alice's ratings on the y-axis and Chuck's ratings on the x-axis, how do they agree with one another? If you drew a line connecting all the points. This is a pretty simple thing to compute. You can do it easily in Excel. The score for a correlation goes from -1 to +1. -1 means there's a completely negative correlation. That would mean that every movie Alice likes, the person we're computing for doesn't like. So every time Alice gives a 5, the other person gives a 1. Every time Alice gives a 1, the other person gives a 5, and so on. So there's a complete opposite relationship between the ratings. A correlation of 0 means essentially there's no relationship. The ratings are just random with respect to one another. And a correlation of 1 means that generally the ratings go the same way. So as Alice's ratings get higher, the other person's ratings also get higher. If we compute this correlation between Bob and Alice, we get a correlation of 0.26. That's pretty low, and it doesn't mean that they're random, but it means there's not a very strong relationship between their ratings. If we compute it between Alice and Chuck, we get a rating of 0.82, which is quite high. This means that Chuck has a stronger correlation with Alice, or his ratings are generally closer to hers. So if we want to recommend the movie Vertigo to Alice, she hasn't rated it, and we'll assume that Bob has rated it a 3 and Chuck has rated it a 5. How do we come up with a recommended rating for Alice? We could just average those 2 scores, which would give us a 4, but since we know that Chuck is a better recommender than Bob, we want to give his rating more weight. So what we do is take each of those ratings and multiply it by the correlation that we already computed. So Bob's rating of a 3 gets multiplied by 0.26, which is his correlation. Chuck's rating of a 5 gets multiplied by 0.82, which is his correlation. To make this a weighted average, we then divide by the sum of those weights, so Bob's 0.26 plus Chuck's 0.82. And if we compute that, that gives us a 4.5. Now remember, we said the simple average of the 3 and the 5 is a 4. Our recommended rating is a 4.5, which is higher, and in fact, that's closer to Chuck's rating of a 5, which makes sense. We want to give Chuck more weight, and so Chuck's rating should factor in more. Thus, our recommended rating's a bit higher. So that's a person similarity recommendation, but we also can do item similarity recommendations. These methods are more complex. They're computed using features of the items. For example, if we were looking at movies, we would consider the genre, the year, the director, actors, and so on. Some sites use very nuanced sets of features, and there's places that you can see this playing out. For example, on Netflix, in my recommendations, it lists some categories of movies that I like. Mind-bending foreign movies, gory end-of-the-world horror movies, independent dramas, and so on. These are categories put together with different features. So you would have gory movies, you would have end-of-the-world movies, you would have horror movies, and all the movies in this gory end-of-the-world horror category fit all three of those features. Similarly, if we look at the top row, there are movies that would be considered mind-bending. There's foreign movies, and all the films in this category meet both of those criteria. So you can see it's not just simple genres and actors and directors, but they're also considering lots of these other features that are added to do item similarity recommendations. Pandora is another site that does item-based similarity. For each movie, for each song, there's about 400 different attributes that they look at. This could be things like African drum beats or heavily featured horn sections, some really sophisticated, nuanced things that cover the melody, the rhythm, the syncopation, the harmonies, and so on. They hire freelance musicians in San Francisco to come in, listen to songs, and check off for each song which of the features in that list of 400 things it matches. When you then pick a song or an artist, it looks for other songs and artists that match the same number of features as closely as possible to the one you liked, and it recommends those. So if we want to find out how good a recommender system is, we generally compute this by looking at the error. So the error of a recommender system, if we pick a particular item, is the difference between my rating and the recommended rating. So if I gave Jaws a rating of 4 stars, and the recommender system says I'll like it at 3 stars, we take the difference between that, 4 minus 3, and that gives us a difference of 1, and 1 is the error. To see how good the system is overall, we take every item that a person has rated and compare their rating with the recommended rating, and then we average the error over all those items, and that gives us a measure of how good the recommender system is. The lower the error, the better the system. Now that makes sense and it's easy to measure, but it's not necessarily the best measure of how good a recommender system is. For example, people tend to prefer serendipity over accuracy, and Pandora is a great example of this. Pandora is a great system because it'll recommend songs and artists to you who you've never heard of but you really like. And that's a great feeling, to discover something you wouldn't have found on your own, but that really meets your tastes. People love this feeling of serendipity, and they're willing to take some inaccurate and poor recommendations in the mix if it increases the serendipity. There's also the issue of diversity. So for example, on Amazon, if you buy a Stephen King book, it's likely to recommend to you 6 other Stephen King books. And while that's probably accurate, if you like one, you're probably going to like the other ones, it's not a very interesting or inspiring set of recommendations. People are willing to accept lower accuracy in the recommendations to get some diversity in the group. So while we have this standard measure, it's important to consider other things that users care about, and that's just a couple of them. So let's move on to the second issue of trust that goes with recommender systems. In particular, this is a feature in my research. I wonder if we have social networks like Facebook or MySpace or LinkedIn, can we use them to build more trusted recommender systems where we find people that we trust, not just who are similar to us, and give them more weight. To do this, we need to know where the trust comes from, how we can compute it, and I'm going to talk briefly about that without getting deeply into the mathematical details, and then we'll look at some example applications of how trust in recommender systems can be applied in a lot of domains. So here's an in-class exercise. I've listed out 10 slots for movies here, and you can fill in your own. For number 1, you should put your favorite movie. On a 5-star scale, it gets 5 stars. Number 2 is your least favorite movie. You give it no stars. It's the worst thing you've ever seen. For movies 3 through 10, you put some mediocre movie that you've seen, you're able to rate it, and you have an opinion, but you don't really care much about it. So the question then is, in which case will you trust me more? And I'll give you 2 options. Option 1, I loved your favorite movie and I hated your least favorite movie, so we completely agree on those 2. But on movies 3 through 10, we have some differences. So maybe on movie 3, I gave it 4 stars. On movie 4, I gave it 1 star, and so on. So there's some variation in those 10 movies, but we agree perfectly on the first 2. In the second case, we agree perfectly on movies 3 through 10, but I hated your favorite movie and I loved your least favorite movie. In that case, the overall difference between us is pretty small because there's only 2 movies we disagree on. But it's those 2 movies that you really care about that we disagree on. So in which of those scenarios do you trust me more? Depending on the person, the answer is different. But overall, when we ask people this question, they tend to say that they'll trust me more when I agree with them on those first 2 important movies and allow for some difference on the other movies than they would if I agree with them on the movies they don't care about but completely disagree with them on the movies that they love. So this leads us to think more carefully about what actually is incorporated when people trust one another if we're looking at similarity in ratings. So we ran an experiment to do this, and it's very similar to the exercise you just did. Our users would rate a bunch of movies, and we would pick 10 of them, and then we'd come up with this hypothetical user and generate some ratings for that user. So here you can see in the first 4 rows, we're working on a 1 to 10 scale where 1 is low and 10 is high. Our user has given either a rating of a 10 or a 1, the highest or lowest possible ratings. Our hypothetical user has given ratings of 4 or 7, and if we look at the third column with difference, we can see our hypothetical person is exactly 6 different from the user on those movies. On the other movies, the user has given some middle-of-the-road ratings between a 3 and an 8. The hypothetical user has given some ratings, and if we look at the difference, we can see that the hypothetical user has given ratings that are exactly 1 different. So there's big differences on the movies where the user's given extremely high or extremely low ratings, and small differences on the rest. We would show this to our subjects in the experiment and ask them, how much do you trust this hypothetical user based on these ratings, and we'd get the responses back. Now, what you can do here is make some subtle adjustments to understand what impacts trust. For example, if the only thing that matters is overall similarity, we could change the differences between movies. So we could say, we'll make the differences just 1 on these first 4 movies, and we'll make those differences of 6 apply to some of these movies towards the bottom where the user has more middle-of-the-road ratings. There, the overall similarity stays the same. We've just switched which movies have the big differences and which movies have the small differences. And if there's no difference in the trust, we can say overall similarity is all that matters. If there is a difference in trust, it means that some movies matter more to the subjects than others. And what we found from this experiment are 4 different factors that impact the trust that people assign. 1 is overall similarity, which makes sense. We tend to trust people who are more similar to us. So the closer you are to me, the more I trust you. The second is this exercise we've just been doing. Similarity on items with extreme ratings. So if I've given something a really high or a really low rating, if everything else is held constant, I trust you more if you agree with me on those than if you agree with me on the things I didn't give those high or low ratings to. It's essentially saying the things that I really care about, either I really love or really hate, I want you to agree with me on those, and I'll trust you more if you do than if you agree with me more on things I don't care so much about. Interestingly, people would look at the single largest difference. They would find the one movie where they disagreed most, and the bigger that disagreement was, the less they trusted the person. You can think of this manifesting itself easily in real life. For example, if you have someone come to house sit for you when you're out of town, and they do it 100 times and everything is great, and the last time they do it your house burns down, even though 100 times they've done it fine and only 1 time has there been a problem, your trust for them is likely to drop because there's a single time where there's a big difference between their expected behavior and their actual behavior. This makes sense in the case of your house burning down, but it's kind of interesting that it manifests itself in movie ratings. And then finally, the subject's propensity to trust. Some people are just very trustworthy and some people aren't. And you want to take into account individuals' preferences when you're working with trust. So we can compute trust as a more sophisticated similarity measure, just like we did with the user-to-user recommender systems. Now I want to show you a few systems that use these trust sort of ratings with social networks to do things for people in online systems. The first system we'll talk about is Advogato. In this system, we don't need to compute trust from similarity and ratings. We actually have users expressing trust through something called peer certification. What this means is users will come into the system and they'll rate other people at one of three levels: a master, a journeyer, or an apprentice, where a master is the top level and apprentice is basically the lowest level. The Advogato site is in the domain of free software development, and so I've included here the definitions of what a master, journeyer, and apprentice are in that domain. Once you have a social network of people who have certified their friends at these different levels, there's an algorithm that gets run on the network that computes an overall certification for each person. So based on what other people have said about you, some may have said you're a master, some may have said you're an apprentice, a couple may list you as a journeyer. The algorithm gets applied and you get a single rating. Once those ratings are computed, they're used in the website. You can look at the website at advogato.org, and those certifications that got computed are used to control permissions on the site. So for example, only certified users have permission to comment on other people's blog posts. A combination of those certifications and users' interest ratings are used to filter blogs when they're shown. So here's an example of that working. This is the recent blog entries page on Advogato, and this is my account we're looking at. So we can see here, next to the title of each rating is a little number in parentheses. In the first purple row, you see the username and then in parentheses a 6.9 after it. In the second purple row, you can see that there's a 6 after it. So on a 1 to 10 scale, where 10 is the best, these ratings have a 6 or 6 point, these blogs have a 6 or 6.9 rating. If we scroll down, try that again. We can see here a blue bar at the top that has a rating of a 9.4. The purple bar in the middle has a rating of a 4.4, and the green bar at the bottom has a rating of 2.4. I can also use these ratings to filter the page, so I can set up preferences that says I should only see blog posts that have ratings over a 5. So the things that I'm less likely to be interested in won't even be shown to me. So this is an interesting way of identifying the importance of items and potentially filtering the information that I'll see based on my trust in users and my interest in what they do. Another system that uses trust is called Moleskine. This site's in Italian, but you can go visit it at moleskine.it. On this site, ski mountaineers provide information about their trips. So if they go out and ski in the morning, they'll come back and give information about the route, the conditions, the weather, and so on. The system is set up with a social network, and users can express their level of trust in other users. And the system uses that trust to show only trusted information to every user, so it filters out reports from people that I don't trust. Because I don't know everybody using the system, there's another algorithm here called FilmTrust that uses the social network, paths between people, and their ratings of one another to estimate how much I'll trust people I don't know. And those estimated ratings are used to filter out people who I don't trust. Here's a screenshot. Again, the page is in Italian, so we can't read a lot of what's going on here. But what we see in this orange box at the bottom is a list of trips from people. And you can see some information about it. If we click on one of those, we get a page like this, which provides us with ratings of the trip, a list of the conditions, the date and time it was taken, and a description that the person has posted. This allows us to make decisions if we're using this website about which routes we should take, understanding which ones are safe and which aren't, and because all of these are dated and time-stamped, we can keep in mind how recent the reports are. The final system we'll look at is FilmTrust. This is the system I built as part of my dissertation work. It's a movie recommender system. It's visible on a website that has a social network where users rate how much they trust their friends about movies. The movie recommendations are made using trust, and it's done in a way very similar to what we saw in the user similarity recommender system earlier in this talk. A recommended rating is basically a weighted average of all the ratings of a movie. So if I'm looking at Jaws, I take everyone's rating and I do a weighted average where the weight given to each person is the trust that I have for them. That trust is either direct, which means I've rated that person myself, or indirect, it's someone I don't know, but I've used the social network and the path between us, along with some algorithms, to come up with a guess of how much I'll trust that user. So here we're looking at a movie page in FilmTrust for the film A Clockwork Orange. I want us to zoom in on this ratings of A Clockwork Orange at the bottom. If we do that, we can see that there's 610 ratings of the system. The average user rating on a 4-star scale is 3 stars. My rating, shown at the bottom, is half a star, which is the lowest possible rating in the system. And my recommended rating is half a star. It matches my rating perfectly. Now, this happens because I tend to trust people who dislike this movie very much. FilmTrust also uses the trust ratings. Now, the first 2 reviews have ratings of half a star. That's their rating of the movie. And the last 2 reviews have movie ratings of 4 stars. Now this correlates with my ratings. The people who have given it half a star, which matches my rating, show up first. The people who have given it higher ratings, which are very different from mine, show up at the bottom. But these aren't sorted by the ratings and how much they agree with mine, though it does work out that way. The value used for sorting is how much trust I have in these people. So it turns out the people that I trust more have lower ratings for the movie, and the people I trust less have higher ratings. There are some challenges to doing recommender systems, particularly those with trust. First is, can these kinds of approaches create problems? Well, recommender systems can often recommend items that are too similar, and that's a critique. So if I only like bluegrass music, it will only recommend bluegrass music. It won't do anything to open up my mind to see new options. So it sort of creates an echo chamber. If you think of applying this in the context of, say, online news, you can eliminate other perspectives and basically reinforce people's stereotypes and biases. This goes along with trust-based recommendations as well. You can prevent the user from seeing other people's perspectives because you only show them information from people they trust who agree with them in those important cases. So some conclusions. First are that recommender systems create personalized suggestions for users. Social trust, which we saw in our last examples, is another way of personalizing content recommendations. If we connect social relationships with online content to highlight the most trustworthy information, it can be a real benefit to users because it allows us to filter things out and highlight the information that they want to see. But there are still many challenges to doing this as well. Listed in the readings are some specific articles on how recommender systems play a role in libraries, and hopefully those will be of interest to you in addition to how these recommender systems play out in systems that you're used to using.